Hello, gang. So today, in today's science class, what we're going to be doing is reviewing a little bit. Let me just make that smaller. There we go. So, in class, we've gone over, we read pages A6 and A7. So I just want to take some time, go back and review those pages a little bit, and then show you a few video clips that we didn't have the chance to get to yet. So, the discovery of cells was the first part of page A6. Microscopes were invented in the early 1600s. One of the first microscopes was built and used by Robert Hooke. In 1665, Hooke observed a thin slice of cork through a microscope. The tiny walled spaces reminded him of tiny rooms, so he called them cells. And up here in the upper right-hand corner, that is what he saw when he looked through that microscope. And this is actually a picture of that first microscope. Okay? The cell is the basic unit of structure and function of all living things, and that's what he found. Okay? We also learned that plants have different cells too. Some plant cells take water in from the soil, others protect the plant, and others make food. So on here I had a picture of some human cheek cells to check out. We're going to check out some cheek cells a little further in our lab this week. This at the bottom is a plant cell. These are some plant cells. So we learned that cells work together to perform basic life processes. Some processes including releasing energy from food, getting rid of body waste, and making new cells for growth and repair. All right, and most plants and animals are made up of many cells. Humans are made of trillions of cells. Organisms with many cells have many different kinds of cells. The size and shape of a cell depends on its function or the job of the cell. And some types of cells include red blood cells, and those are the small disc-shaped ones. And I'll go back and I'll show you that picture in a second. We have muscle cells. They're long, thin, and they produce movement. And nerve cells carry signals from the brain to the muscles, and they're very long. Okay, so let's go back, maybe. And I wanted to show you, these are actually red blood cells right here. And on our first page here, oops, nope, that's not it. My mad scientist. Page before this, okay, this is actually bottom right-hand corner are nerve cells, and there's your plant cells again down here that I showed you. Okay, I wanted to show those guys to you. Nerve cells, pretty cool looking. Okay, let me go back to just want to show you this one. This is just an introduction to cells and just give you a little more information on this slide, and you have access to this presentation so that you can look at it for reference. On this slide, I have linked the Flippity study cards, so you can click on the microscope for that. There's actually a Quizlet vocab review here for these two. And so let's go ahead and we'll check out this video.
The Cell, an intro for kids from Sanger Academy. Every living thing is made up of cells. Just as walls are made of bricks, a class is made of students, or a book is made of pages. In the same way, all living things are made up of cells. So, you are made up of cells. If you want to understand life, you have to understand cells. So, what is a cell? The first thing you need to know is that cells are very small. So small, you almost always need a microscope to see them. Let's compare a cell to something very small that you can see, like a human hair. Look at how wide a human hair is. An average human hair, that means not too thick, not too thin. How small would one human cell, let's say a red blood cell, be compared to that hair, which you can see? First, we need to zoom in on one hair. Is a red blood cell that wide? No, smaller. This wide? Even smaller. A red blood cell is this small next to an average human hair. What does it look like if we zoom in on it? Something like this. In case you were wondering, all cells are made of atoms. Atoms are much, much smaller than cells. If you saw a cell this close up, atoms would still be too small to see. All cells are surrounded by a sort of skin called the cell membrane or plasma membrane. The jelly-like stuff inside the cell, surrounded by that skin, is generally called the cytoplasm. You know that the body has many organs such as the brain, lungs, and stomach. Well, a cell is kind of like a little body unto itself because inside of it are tiny organs called organelles, little organs. Those organelles are themselves surrounded by membranes. There are many different kinds of organelles, like the nucleus, ribosomes, mitochondria, and the Golgi apparatus. But I'll save discussion of the organelles for a different video. Just as all the organs of an animal work together to keep it alive, so all the little organs of a cell, the organelles, work together to keep it alive. So, if cells have a bunch of organelles, can't there be whole animals that are made of just one cell? Are there single-celled animals? Well, if they are that small, we wouldn't call them animals. We could call them organisms, because they do have organs, or organelles anyway. But they are very small organisms, so we call them microorganisms. Micro means small. So, yes, there are microorganisms made of a single little cell. But if we want to say more, we need to look inside the cell again. Every single living cell contains some very complicated stuff, some instructions that tell the cell what to do. This stuff is called deoxyribonucleic acid. Say it with me. Deoxyribonucleic acid. Deoxyribonucleic acid is also called DNA. DNA is the command center of the cell. In the cells of humans, other animals, and plants, the most important organelle is called the nucleus. And it's important because that's where the DNA is. But some other cells do not have a nucleus. They do have DNA. It's just floating around in the cell's cytoplasm. Cells that have a nucleus are called eukaryotic cells. Cells that don't have a nucleus are called prokaryotic cells. Eu means they do. Pro means they don't. As I said, humans, other animals, and plants all have eukaryotic cells, cells with nuclei. Nuclei is the plural of nucleus. There are also microorganisms, single-celled organisms, like tiny animals and plants, which have eukaryotic cells. These are called protists. So, what sort of organisms have prokaryotic cells? Again, that means cells without nuclei. They're all microorganisms, all single-celled organisms, called prokaryotes. One example is the bacterium. We say one bacterium, many bacteria. So bacteria, like the kind in your yogurt and your stomach, are single-celled organisms without nuclei. They are prokaryotes. Most prokaryotes, like bacteria, not only don't have nuclei, they don't have any membrane-surrounded organelles. Some of them do have little hairs or tails. There's much more to say on the subject of cells, but anyway, that's what a cell is. The end.
Okay, so that was the first one I wanted to show you. Okay, here's another one.
In 1665, a British scientist named Robert Hooke used a simple microscope to look at a thin slice of cork. He saw something that looked like this. You observe. Describe what Hooke saw. Hooke saw hundreds of tiny little boxes, which he called cells. What he was actually seeing was the remaining walls of once living plant cells. Later, a Dutch scientist named Antoine van Leeuwenhoek used a simple microscope to identify tiny animals in pond water and blood cells in different animals. He was also the first person to see bacteria, and he discovered that yeast, used to make bread dough rise, is actually a single-celled organism. Following the discoveries of Hooke and van Leeuwenhoek, it took scientists over 150 years to realize that all living things are made of cells. In the late 1830s, a German scientist named Theodor Schwann concluded that all plants and animals are made of cells. Schwann developed the first two parts of what is now called the cell theory. The first part states that all organisms are made up of one or more cells. So, all living things, from very small organisms to animals as large as elephants, are made up of cells. The second part of the cell theory states that the cell is the basic unit of life in all living things. This means that no life can exist without cells. About 20 years later, a German doctor, Rudolf Virchow, concluded that cells only develop from other cells. This third idea was added to the cell theory, stating that all cells come from previously existing cells. So, in other words, cells can't just magically appear. They have to come from other cells as they divide. Together, these three very important concepts make up the cell theory.
Okay, and this is another one, another quick
I've been
clip.
using Grammarly since high school. I'm going to tell you guys a bit more about Grammarly. So what the application provides is
one of the great things about science is that when scientists make a discovery, it's not always in a prescribed manner, as in only in a laboratory under strict settings with white lab coats and all sorts of neat science gizmos that go beep. In reality, the events and people involved in some of the major scientific discoveries are as weird and varied as they get. My case in point, The Weird History of the Cell Theory. There are 3 parts to the cell theory. 1. All organisms are composed of 1 or more cells. 2. The cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. And 3. All cells come from pre-existing cells. To be honest, this all sounds incredibly boring until you dig a little deeper into how the world of microscopic organisms and this theory came to be. It all started in the early 1600s in the Netherlands, where a spectacle maker named Zacharias Janssen is said to have come up with the first compound microscope, along with the first telescope. Both claims are often disputed, as apparently he wasn't the only bored guy with a ton of glass lenses to play with at the time. Despite this, the microscope soon became a hot item that every naturalist or scientist at the time wanted to play with, making it much like the iPad of its day. One such person was a fellow Dutchman by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who heard about these microscope doohickeys, and instead of going out and buying one, he decided to make his own. And it was a strange little contraption indeed, as it looked more like a tiny paddle the size of a sunglass lens. If he had stuck 2 together, it probably would have made a wicked set of sunglasses that you couldn't see much out of. Anywho, once Leeuwenhoek had his microscope ready, he went to town looking at anything and everything he could with them, including the gunk on his teeth. Yes, you heard right. He actually discovered bacteria by looking at dental scrapings, which, when you keep in mind that people didn't brush their teeth much, if at all, back then, he must have had a lovely bunch of bacteria to look at. When he wrote about his discovery, he didn't call them bacteria as we know them today, but he called them animalcules because they looked like little animals to him. While Leeuwenhoek was staring at his teeth gunk, he was also sending letters to a scientific colleague in England by the name of Robert Hooke. Hooke was a guy who really loved all aspects of science, so he dabbled in a little bit of everything, including physics, chemistry, and biology. Thus it is Hooke who we can thank for the term the cell, as he was looking at a piece of cork under his microscope, and the little chambers he saw reminded him of cells, or the rooms monks slept in their monasteries. Think college dorm rooms, but without the TVs, computers, and really annoying roommates. Hooke was something of an underappreciated scientist of his day, something he brought upon himself as he made the mistake of locking horns with one of the most famous scientists ever, Sir Isaac Newton. Remember when I said Hooke dabbled in many different fields? Well, after Newton published a groundbreaking book on how planets move due to gravity, Hooke made the claim that Newton had been inspired by Hooke's work in physics. Newton, to say the least, did not like that, which sparked a tense relationship between the two that lasted even after Hooke died, as quite a bit of Hooke's research, as well as his only portrait, was misplaced due to Newton. Much of it was rediscovered, thankfully, after Newton's time, but not his portrait, as sadly no one knows what Robert Hooke looked like. Fast forward to the 1800s, where 2 German scientists discovered something that today we might find rather obvious, but helped tie together what we now know as the cell theory. The first scientist was Matthias Schleiden, a botanist who liked to study plants under a microscope. From his years of studying different plant species, it finally dawned on him that every single plant he had looked at were all made of cells. At the same time, on the other end of Germany was Theodor Schwann, a scientist who not only studied slides of animal cells under the microscope and got a special type of nerve cell named after him, but also invented rebreathers for firefighters and had a kickin' pair of sideburns. After studying animal cells for a while, he too came to the conclusion that all animals were made of cells. Immediately, he reached out via snail mail, as Twitter had yet to be invented, to other scientists working in the same field, and it was Schleiden who got back to him, and the two started working on the beginnings of the cell theory. A bone of contention arose between them, as for the last part of the cell theory, that cells come from pre-existing cells, Schleiden didn't exactly subscribe to that thought, as he swore cells came from free cell formation, where they just kind of spontaneously crystallized into existence. That's when another scientist, named Rudolf Virchow, stepped in with research showing that cells did come from other cells. Research that was actually, how to put it, borrowed without permission from a Jewish scientist by the name of Robert Remak, which led to 2 more feuding scientists. Thus, from teeth gunk to torquing off Newton, crystallization to Schwann cells, the cell theory came to be an important part of biology today. Some things we know about science today may seem boring, but how we came to know them is incredibly fascinating. So if something bores you, dig deeper. It's probably got a really weird story behind it somewhere.
Okay, so the last thing I wanted you to do today was just double check your notes for pages A6 and A7. So what I'm going to do is put the notes up on the screen. What I would like you to do is pause the video so that you can go ahead and check pages A6 and A7. You can go ahead and pause it, check it. Okay, and then I'm going to scroll down. So hopefully you paused it. I'm going to scroll so that you can see the rest of this page. Go ahead and pause again and check. Make sure that you fix anything that you got incorrect. Okay, and this is where we're at. All right. So hopefully you paused. If you need to rewind a little bit and go back and double check your work, that's fine. Please, let me just double check our assignments. Maybe if I can find them. There we are. Make sure that you fill out the exit ticket for today. So if you look at your assignment, it'll say Google Forms sign in. That's your exit ticket for today. You have a quiz, a vocabulary quiz on September 14th. You may use the flashcards on Flippity to study, as well as your vocabulary definitions that you did in class. If you have any questions about today's lesson or your quiz or the exit ticket, let me know. Have a great one.